everyone. My name is Timothy Berry, and I work at our global business organization for the ads policy team here at Google. And it's with great pleasure and honor I welcome you to our Talks at Google series. I just want to let the audience know that we will be taking questions for today's talk. And this is an initiative that we worked with in partnership with VetNet, Pride at Google, and all with the general support at our Talks with Google team. Talks at Google brings thinkers, creators, makers, and doers, and today's guest, without a doubt, fits all of those buckets and some. Major General recently retired Tammy Smith in 2012 became the military's highest ranking openly LGBTQ officer, when she was promoted to Brigadier General at the time at the Women's Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery with her wife Tracy. She was who pinned her General Star on her uniform. It should also be noted that Tammy is also one of less than 7% of women who are performed as general officers within our U.S. military. Tammy is also a graduate of the University of Oregon's RTC program, a program where she was the first woman to become a general officer. Tammy's career expands 35 years of service to the nation, where she served in a variety of roles that included her time as a military advisor to the Secretary of the Army, in service, and along with service in Afghanistan as the Chief of Army Reserve Affairs for U.S. 40 staff. The issues that Tammy has worked on throughout her career include work with military families, along with a host of other related issues as relates to inclusion with an intersectional lens. And with that, I want to say, Tammy, welcome to Google.
Timothy, I've been so looking forward to this talk today. Good to see you.
Good to see you, and a happy Pride.
Yeah, happy Pride.
Yeah, so this talk is going to be full of just interesting topics or kind of topics of conversation that have been coming up in the news. But just to start, one of the things we like to do at Google is we have a new team member on, and for this hour, you are part of the Google family. We like to have just a quick little chat, just to get a little bit better sense of you. So, we know who Major General Tammy Smith is, but let's talk about Tammy for a little bit. So, quick question for you: coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Good. Favorite singer, band, or musician?
Oh boy, that one's tough. I'm gonna just go with streaming 80s music on a Saturday morning.
Okay, solid. Let's go to a complete era. I was like a 90s R&B guy for a while, so it's smart. So, as queer folks, a lot of times we always have, celebrity crushes that we were growing up. So, first childhood celebrity crush.
Oh boy, that one's tough. Okay, based on my age, had to be Martina Navratilova, the tennis player.
Oh wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, that's a solid choice. Like also phenomenal athlete in general. I would oscillate between Trey Songz and Paul Walker sometimes. So it was depending on my mood. So if you weren't in the military, what would have been your chosen career?
Well, I thought that I was going to be an agricultural journalist.
Agricultural journalist. Tell us what that is.
What's that?
Tell us what that is.
What that is. So I grew up in this little town in Oakland, Oregon, and I was involved in 4-H and Future Farmers of America and all those sort of things. And I like to write. And so, when you don't know much about what your job options are, I just thought being a journalist, but I liked agriculture. So I was going to go and be an agricultural journalist and write about the agricultural industry. And I mean, it really is a thing, but my path took me on a little different way.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit about your time in the FFA, because I'm looking at your bio. The FFA and then how that got you into RTC is just a very interesting story. I hope we have time to go over. Yeah. Your proudest moment in life.
Oh boy, I don't know what my proudest moment. There's been so many things that I have been exposed to that have brought me pride, but pride we'll say proudest moment in a selfish way, perhaps, is graduating jump master school in the Army. I was so proud of that because it was so hard, and I had to do it twice. So I failed the first time and had to go through it twice. But I would have to say, when you look back on the war stories you'll tell after 35 years, I would probably still talk about going to jump master school.
That's a good one. If you, in context, can you tell our audience what jump master is?
Okay, great. So jump master. So in the Army, you can have lots of different jobs, lots of different ways to get to the battlefield. One of the ways that you can do that is by jumping out of an airplane. And so the parachute soldiers have to have jump masters who are the soldiers who are trained to understand how to get them safely into the aircraft and out the door of the aircraft onto the drop zone. So a lot of technical safety things that go with that. But being a jump master means that you're the one responsible for taking all those jumpers and getting them safely to the ground out of that aircraft.
But at least you're in the plane this time.
Well, you're the last jumper out.
Yeah, you can kind of sit out. And then my last question for you is, what does Pride Month mean for you?
Yeah, what Pride Month means for me is it's a month of reflection, because we see it as the celebration, but the celebration is the outcome of what so many other people did for generations before me, and for all generations. So while I like the Pride Party, I like the feeling of dignity that celebrating Pride brings to me. For me, it is just a reminder and a history lesson of all the people who made it this way for the rest of us.
Yeah, I love how you put that. It truly is about dignity and a sense of belonging too. It's really, really great. So not to like jump too far down to serious discussion, but there's been pretty significant news coming out of Veterans Affairs Administration that I thought it would be important for us to talk about, and I would just love your comment on, especially as you're recently retired, you're a civilian, so. The VA has announced that they are now going to be paying for veterans who are seeking gender reassignment surgery. Can you tell us, like, what does this mean for those veterans who need this type of healthcare, and then also just your own generalized feelings about this pretty like significant policy change?
No, this is big news, and good news for many people who might not have thought previously that they could have access to the type of healthcare that for them is healthcare that is necessary for who they are as a person. So, I think that this is good news. I haven't got a lot of the details about how the VA intends to do this, but being a veteran, I mean, you have access to all of these variety of programs. I mean, our country is a very generous program when it comes to what all of you provide to somebody who has served. And so I'm hopeful that the news about this gets out to the community affected by it, and then that they are able to leverage these veterans' benefits that they have earned by virtue of their service.
And pretty much in a similar front in terms of the policies, in terms of personnel issues. I would like for you to talk to us about looking at like the intersectional voice and what the policy implementation policy, like, actual, not just implementation, but effects of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. You've spoken about how a lot of the soldiers that were discharged from the military because of Don't Ask, Don't Tell were not given honorable discharges. If you could first just explain for the audience, what was Don't Ask, Don't Tell? And then secondary to that, what is the process like for a soldier once they leave service, and why is it a big deal if you do not receive an honorable discharge once you leave the force?
Okay, yeah, no, this is great because we always think about Don't Ask, Don't Tell as being the reason why people who were gay got kicked out of the army or got kicked out of the service. But there has been a long-standing policy, even before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which came into place in 1993, in which people who were homosexual were not allowed to be in the military, or they were kicked out of the military if they were discovered. So I think through this in my own timeline of 35 years. When I started went into ROTC and Reserve Officer Training Corps and used my Army scholarship to go to college back in the 80s, the policy then that was in place was that just simply being or identifying as somebody who's a homosexual was enough that you were not allowed to be in the military. So if you made an admission, if somebody ratted on you, you were actually not allowed to be in the military. Your mere presence was an affront to good order and discipline, and so what Don't Ask, Don't Tell did then, so I started under that policy that was purely you could not be in. In 1981, they even started asking you if you went to see the recruiter, you actually had to answer a question on your enlistment form that asked whether or not you had ever engaged in homosexual activity. And if you answered yes to that, then you were ineligible to serve in the military. So in '93, things in society were changing a little bit different than they were in the 80s. Lots of conversations about increased rights, those sort of things. And so there was a discussion about, well, maybe we should allow our people to serve openly in the US military. And what came of that is the actual law that became now known as Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And so it became known as Don't Ask, Don't Tell because what was supposed to happen is, so like, don't ask. So they took the question off the enlistment form, so they wouldn't ask you anymore. They took away the requirement for if you had to get a security clearance and it came up as a part of your security clearance, that you would get kicked out for that. They took some things like that away. So Don't Ask, Don't Tell became a compromise that said that, okay, we know you exist, but we can't know about you. You can't tell us, you can't give us any indication. So your life was the same. I mean, you lived the same because you could still get kicked out, but it felt different in '93 because you actually felt like they knew you existed. And I mean, that's powerful that your organization knows that you existed. But I will tell you that people who were discovered and were kicked out, whether it was pre Don't Ask, Don't Tell or Don't Ask, Don't Tell, what happened to them is that just being a homosexual and having your discharge paperwork characterized as homosexuality resulted in a less than honorable or lesser than honorable discharge. And the negative consequence of that is that we open talking a little bit about VA benefits, is that some of the benefits that are offered to you as a veteran are tied directly to your characterization of service. Like, did you serve honorably, dishonorably, other than honorably? So we have a pocket of folks in America who are veterans who serve their country honorably, except that our country said that type of who you are is not honorable. And they've got this paperwork now that doesn't allow them access to the benefits that we opened with. So yeah, I'll pause there so you can interject any clarifying
Yeah.
questions. But that kind of catches us up over kind of the many years of this policy.
No, what you're talking about is just, there's so many different layers. But I wanted to also just bring in the fact that you've worked in human capital. I spent some time in higher education at West Point, and I also spent some time here at Google as a recruiter. And a lot of employers will ask, "Hey, I see you have military service. Can you list out for us where, was it honorable, was it less than honorable?" And so there's a lot of outside just the VA system. There's this, we're talking about employment and workforce development, and also just not just about like the victim, but the communities these folks go into. We're not allowed to have like that talent that could be brought into their organization to really to improve things. So there's just a lot of downstream effects to all of this.
There were so many barriers with that. And you think about how punishing that is. I mean, I have to believe the government policymakers knew what they were doing when they said, we're going to write homosexuality right on that paper. And you're right, is that when then you're going into the workforce and you say, well, what have you done up to this point? Well, I was in the Army for 3 years. Oh, well, let me see your discharge paperwork, which is, you're right, a very common question. And it was marked in that way. The good news now, jumping ahead to 2021 and some work that has been done since the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the being allowed to serve openly, that started in 2011 for people who identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, didn't affect transgender individuals, is that there have been more streamlined ways for people who got kicked out for nothing else than, their paperwork says homosexual, other than honorable discharge or less than honorable, is that these services have streamlined some of the bureaucratic processes that allows them to go in and have their paper essentially upgraded to an honorable discharge. And in the Army, I was personally witness to it as a staff officer in the Army Pentagon, and the fact that they were glad, they were proud to be doing this, that the folks who did the corrections, the board of corrections, you got a sense that they felt like that they were righting an institutional wrong. At least that's the personal perception that I took away from that.
do you get the sense that a lot of people know what the process is to get these discharges upgraded to an improved status, or?
I know, I think that quite often they don't know where to start, because we're a big bureaucracy, and so I think a lot of people don't know where to start. And so a couple places that they can start is that there is an organization that is has changed. It was a Service Members Legal Defense Network, and there's been several organizations that have joined and changed. It's now the Modern Military Association of America, and the grassroots, or the roots of the Service Members Legal Defense Network, was to provide legal representation for individuals who are being kicked out of the Army for being gay. And so this new organization that has reformed itself and repurposed itself to suit today's soldiers, they still carry forward the assistance of helping people who want to have their paper corrected. So the Modern Military Association of America. And then within each services, there is a formal military board of correction that I would say, could I say Google search here? That maybe a good Google search would give them then the point of contact specific to their service, because the application will be made, whether you're an airman, a sailor, a marine, you'll make this application through your individual service.
That's the. Thank you for providing that information. We'll talk to VetNet to see how we can amplify that.
Yeah,
Important.
and it's really weird and I'm fortunate in that I stayed under the radar for the first 25 years. And thank you for making this something to talk about, because I've met so many individuals who were discharged, and they felt ashamed of their service when they had done nothing wrong except be who they were. Their service was honorable. They were good soldiers and sailors. And so the correction of that paper is part of their healing process in a military that didn't treat them with the dignity and respect that should have just been given because they volunteered to be in our military.
Yeah, absolutely. It's yeah, beyond time. So yeah, really appreciate you bringing this up to. To slightly like similar topic, I was looking at an interview that you did when you received when you were promoted. You were receiving a lot of attention around the fact that you were a member of the LGBTQ community. And the interview you did with NPR on August 14th, you the basically like the commentary was asking about, well, how does it feel? Because you were that you came out. That everybody was using the term that you were coming out. But you said something that I thought was very, very interesting, and I thought it was very insightful. You said, in regards to my life, I don't think of it as I came out so much as you're talking about your wife.
Mm-hmm.
Her participation gave people, and you're talking into your promotion ceremony. Her participation gave people a view into my authentic life, to our authentic life, to our authentic life. So it doesn't even feel as much as I came out, though it may seem like that in a couple of headlines in the paper that apparently I did, but it was more about the recognition of family and the fact that Tracy is indeed my family. Can you talk to us like why did you feel it was so important to make that point?
Yeah, it was, all of this was new to everyone. So repeal happened in September 2011. I was notified for promotion to Brigadier General in May of 2012, and the actual ceremony was in August of 2012. So I had adequate time to freak out between my notification and the fact that just by timing, it isn't anything I sought out. It was just by timing. I might be the first general who showed up to a promotion ceremony with a wife instead of a husband, in my case. And so Tracy and we felt strongly that as senior military leaders, what we should be role modeling is simply that we are a military family that happens to be gay, not a gay family that happens to be in the military, that, we lead with our military identity. And so we approached it wanting this to be a military story more than an LGBTQ community story, wanted it to be a military story. And one of the things that we did, and this was Tracy's advice, she's way smarter than I am, is that she said, we should give an interview before the ceremony, because your story's going to get told, and if we don't tell it, somebody's going to tell it in a way that might not be aligned with what we really meant to say. And so that NPR interview was actually only the second interview that I had done. And Tracy and I had done one together the day before the promotion, and we selected the outlet, and we selected Stars and Stripes, which is a Department of Defense newspaper. And we had asks, from LGBTQ type publications and lots of other types of publication. But again, we thought this was a military story in the first place, that we needed to talk about the fact that you now had a Brigadier General who was going to bring her wife to things, was to talk about that in the military community.
And Tammy, I was also thinking too that you've never like labeled yourself as like as an activist, and I think a lot of times civilians still think of somebody who comes from a military establishment to be that way. But in kind of in a way you have been, because before that in Stars and Stripes, did you pen a letter basically anonymously saying that Donuts Don't Tell was a terrible policy, and that of all the damage you're doing, it's like not only just military readiness, but like, could you talk about what was your thought process doing that? And I'll piggyback it further, because and also when you were at the University of Oregon, you convinced the University of Oregon to keep the RTC program when Donuts Don't Tell was being installed, which is so I just see like a theme with you. It's just very quietly just pushing.
There is it is probably a theme, but it's a theme that's aligned with the values. So for me, part of when you have an institution that doesn't want you to be who you are, for gay people, is what they are trying to do is, I never felt like I was lying, because I would only be lying if I let them take away my dignity. And so I never told, and I never let them take the dignity of who I was. So there were inflection points throughout my life, is what you're describing, where when I had an opportunity to contribute to the conversation in a way that would not out me, I did. Interestingly, the editorial that I wrote under the name, I think it was Allison, it was for, I think it went to the Stars and Stripes. It was the same reporter. And that's who we felt comfortable going to when we then told our story and did our live interview. But the thing about Don't Ask, Don't Tell was that it literally created a law that prevented me from speaking up for myself, and for allowing you to know who I was, and allowing stereotypes instead to try and tell you who that I was. So we either had to use other people's voices to speak on our behalf, and that's why I'm so grateful to the history that we're celebrating in Pride Month. But we also, in that we had to take these anonymous opportunities whenever we could, to let people understand what it was like to live our particular life, what our lived experience was. And there were only a few ways to do that, coming through there. And the editorials and influencing. Another thing that I did is that people went down to lobby and to talk with members of Congress, as organizations did. The Service Members Legal Defense Fund Network did this a great deal. I would send Tracy down, my wife Tracy down, she would take part in these, and I would do talking points and all of these things from an insider's perspective about what they should talk with the lawmakers about, and how it affected people who are currently serving.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing story. Sorry, did you have anything else you want to add? Okay. Slightly off topic, or not completely off topic, but it's still like about you. So like you're recently retired from the service, and you're going through something that a lot of veterans go through. Like I said, I'm an Army veteran. Spent time 101st, and spent time at West Point. And we all kind of go through this transition that's not just about a career transition, but really it's like a lifestyle transition. Yeah. And you actually studied how senior leaders transition to new organization. Being someone that's now transitioned and continue to transition, can you talk to us about how some of the things that you learned just like in your academic studies around like this topic, but then also relate that back to like your own experiences so far?
Yeah, well, I will tell you that transition is scary because of the unknown. After 35 years of military service, I've got a lot of muscle memory about what my day is supposed to look like and how my world is structured. And the fear of the unknown after that transition is whether or not I'm able going to be able to feel comfortable without that known structure. It's something simple like at this time last month, if I walked into a room at the Pentagon, people would stand up. Now if I walk into a room of people just as me, they think it's somebody's grandmother who's lost. And so just some of these things that we get used to in our formalities and our transitions. So for me, the fear of the unknown caused a great deal of anxiety. Now I'm only been retired now for about 3 weeks. And so I'm still a little bit in the honeymoon phase of just like really glad I don't have to go to work every day for a little while. But I think that like organizations that do so much to make sure that it's a place where veterans would want to be. I think that the focus of an organization on being able to articulate these are the values of our organizations, and this is how we work in teams, and this is how you're going to find your new team in our organization. I think that sort of transition from what I have seen other people who are ahead of me in my journey, and the veterans, probably you yourself, is that you're looking for it's not necessarily the structure of the military, but the structure of the expectations of the values, so that when you're acting on your own, you're still acting within the organization's interests and doing the right thing on behalf of your team that are now your new team.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's like it is one of those things too, because you have to kind of get a sense of just like what is like the heartbeat of the organization, what are things they actually affect. And sometimes it's not completely clear. So it's like a constant learning like journey like along the way for sure.
Yeah.
Also, like one of my questions for you as it's speaking to like transitioning veterans, can you talk to us about like when you were counseling soldiers or working with soldiers who were about to transition back to civilian life? What were those conversations like for you? Like, what was some of the piece of advice that you would try to give them?
Yeah. Well, the biggest one for me is that whether you're transitioning into civilian life or whether you're moving on to a new job, is that be who you are. Is that the
Mhm.
person that you are being that has gotten you to this particular level of your particular success. Don't change that just because you're going to change your environment. The Just who you are, where you are, is you can't hide that. So you go into a new environment and you may think that you need to fake a little bit or modify who you are. At the end of the day, people know when you're faking.
Mhm.
And so when you make these transitions, just remember those things that had helped you be successful in the environment. Those things are going to transfer over to a new environment. And we see that a lot as people move up levels and they become maybe a higher supervisory level or have more responsibilities. Like all of a sudden they think they need to be a hard nose or
Mhm.
something like that. And it wasn't being a hard nose that got you there. So just to continue to be the same person that you are in that new environment.
And looking back on your career, like being like someone who you have so many different intersectional ideas. You're from Oregon. You went to the RTC program, being a woman, being part of the LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
As it pertains to like your own like leadership philosophy and just like how you went about your day to day, can you talk to like how did you? What were some like your principles that you brought to bear, given all those different identities that also brought within their own culture that made Tammy who she is today?
Yeah, it's interesting because you think about those things that you bring into maybe a supervisory role, and as an Army officer, I mean, you are always in a supervisory role just by the nature of the structure of our organization. And some of those tools I've used have, of course, changed over 35 years because I've gone from being a direct level leader all the way to running a large organization. Through it all, I have used collaboration as one of just the key of me, of that I want to have a collaborative buy-in about what we're doing. But I will tell you that's easier as a general than it is as a new lieutenant. Because as a new lieutenant, everything that you are doing moves much more quickly. I mean, you're directing a platoon into combat, you're trying to get the trucks out of the motor pool, you're doing these things that are action oriented. And sometimes a collaborative approach um, clouds the water, because sometimes in simple direct tasks people just want to be told what to do and when they're supposed to do it. So part of being a collaborative approach person has to do a lot also with where you are in your spectrum of leadership and the time available. But I have found that collaboration and getting people to buy into why they're doing something has served me well, even though I was probably a less successful leader early in my career with that collaborative approach than I was later as a more senior person, where things are more ambiguous. You're not sure what the budget is going to be. You're not sure what they're going to think of that over there in the HR department. Some other things. Having that a collaborative approach in an environment that's more senior and more ambiguous was actually um, probably more effective than using that approach earlier in my career.
And like just giving back on, like I guess, what you could, can you give us a time where you were trying to install that collaborative program and it was more difficult to get to accomplish like the mission in particular?
Yeah, but yeah, when I was a captain, and so I was responsible for when soldiers go to basic training, when they first go to boot camp. And so you have all the soldiers learning their new task, and you've got the drill sergeants who are, you can picture them from all the movies, right? For those who might be listening who haven't had that military experience, the guys in the Smokey Bear hats that yell at you. And my collaborative approach with the soldiers was in direct confrontation with the drill sergeant approach to how they train soldiers. We back in the early '90s, they still trained their soldiers separately, meaning by gender. You would either have all women in one cycle, you'd have all men in the next one. The drill sergeants would be both men and women, mostly men. And so when we had a all female or an all women group come through of trainees, 250, I was a rarity in the early '90s, just being in a leadership role in this training environment. And one of the things that I did, getting to the collaboration piece, is that um, I wanted the all the women to be able to pass their fitness test on the first try. And one of the ways to do that then is that we had to change up some of the ways that we were delivering fitness to kind of meet their physical needs, which were different than when we had all men. And then another thing that I did is I was more involved and more physically present than maybe the drill sergeants needed me to be, because I was role modeling some of this stuff. So in that environment where the drill sergeants had this really, really straightforward, strict way of the way that they train soldiers, getting the collaboration to move them towards that maybe we need to modify a few of our standard off the shelf things when we have all women versus all men. I ran into a little friction on there, but we did indeed get the graduation rates that we were looking for. I don't know if I made it harder or if it felt harder because of the resistance at the time that was occurring.
Yeah, no, this is just like a really, really interesting story. And you use a word there that I think a lot of organizations are talking about, which is like collaboration. And
Yeah.
this past year, we all went through a very hard and tough global
Yeah.
pandemic where a lot of people had passed away and were injured. But it also installed like a new concept just about like what does it mean to work? Like,
Mm-hmm.
do you have to come into the office to do good work? Can collaboration be done all virtually? Like being as somebody who's like worked in like human capital management, I'm just curious to think about from your sense, and even just use like that inclusion lens, like, what has been like your understanding of like work from home and like what are like the opportunities,
Mhm.
where like some like the concerns, like how do you think about these things when you're trying to like lead larger organizations?
Yeah, just as you were describing that a bit, I hadn't thought of through this quite lenses before, but we all want to get to inclusion, but really, inclusion and collaboration are kind of hand in hand when I think about, because we want people to collaborate in a way to take these separate parts and make something better than all the separate parts. And with our inclusion, you can't get to collaboration if people don't feel like they can bring those parts to the table and talk about them. And I think what we were able to learn through this collective pandemic experience, depending on what line of work you are, there were many of us who had the privilege of being able to maybe go to work just like this and, from our homes and safely and collaborate. But I think that we opened up an entirely different dimension of how people interact and communicate as part of their collaboration. And we found that people who maybe weren't as comfortable in a in-person setting with feeling included and bringing their piece to the table so they can add to that collaboration felt perfectly fine in talking to their computer screen and with their earphones in or
Mhm.
being on the instant message chat. And so I think for me, what I observed in my own workplace is that it opened up conversations much more in a way that than we were having when we were set in that we had to have the meeting at 10 and you knew who was supposed to be there and there could be no lurkers because there were only 10 chairs in the room, so the two people that wanted the information couldn't actually come. So I think that there were a lot of things about collaboration that if we continue to use them actually improved how we not only collaborate but how we get to inclusion in our workplaces.
Do you think work from home is a pretty significant opportunity, particularly for like LGBT folks that are looking to join an organization?
Oh, I think for all types of people,
Mhm.
I really think that this should be an option, virtual type of work. I know that I never thought as a two-star general I would be working from, my home office in a collaborative way, using Teams as my primary platform, but that's the approach that we took for COVID safety in the type of work we did with policy. I mean, it was meetings, it was writing, it was conversations. I never had to kick down a door or storm a hill or anything
Mhm.
while working at the Pentagon. So I never would have
Or
guessed that we
different
would
type of
even
help.
send uniformed people home to work from a computer. But what we found is that people were actually pretty effective in this sort of environment. So I hope that our Department of Defense, whether it's Pentagon centric, higher headquarters, however it is, I hope that there will always be an element of this hybrid, at least, that allows people to have this sort of work environment. I mean, because otherwise people are going to leave the military, they're going to go work for Google. So we have to make sure that we keep evolving in our own workplace so that we could retain that talent.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, we'll try to get Tammy on Google Meet more than Microsoft. No, they're both great. I wanted before we go into like audience questions, Tim, is there anything else that you wanted to highlight about just like your own career, any other like issues that you want to bring up before we go to audience questions?
Yeah, I know that I often get asked after, like say, the longevity of my career and having now just almost 10 years that I got to serve without the ban, but about being gay in the military. And I get asked, is it harder to be a woman in the military or is it harder to be gay? And for the first 25 years, it wasn't a question because people weren't supposed to know that I was gay. And so, I always answer that question is that being a woman in a male dominated industry has its own barriers, and they aren't necessarily in the army. They were policy barriers also because there were literally jobs that I was prohibited from having that were combat related, and some of those types of jobs. But even as we are thinking about all of the advances that we have made for inclusion and diversity in our workplaces, that we have to remember that that it's still difficult for women in industries, especially that were designed by and for men. That there are many cultural barriers that still exist on our expectations of what women's jobs are supposed to be.
Mhm.
I know in my own time in the military, I had an opportunity to be, it's called the Battalion S3. And so it's the key operations officer at this level of command. And in I'll try and explain this in non-army. So in an organization, there are of a battalion where you've got this operations officer. There's two senior officers there. They're both majors. There's the executive officer and there's the operations officer, and you have to have more experience. So that's why you've got the higher rank.
Mhm.
And then the other officers like the personnel and admin and logistics officer. They're at a lower grade, so they're captains. So I came in as a major and got introduced by the other major who was there and said, this is Major Smith. She's new to our unit. And somebody said, oh, we didn't even know we were going to get a new personnel officer. Even though I was already the higher rank, they couldn't get it around their head that I would be anything other than the personnel officer, because that's the role typically women filled in the male-dominated organization. So, there are many things that we're blind to, that there's still these cultural barriers. And so, I always answer that question. It was harder coming through for most of it, being a woman than it was being gay.
Well, I guess, Tammy, like, how did you, when you were confronted with those situations, like, how did you navigate that? While at Google, we have this concept around psychological safety, is basically saying, you being able to be, vulnerable and authentic creates better team. How are you able to protect like your own psychological safety, but then also at the same time deal with and try to navigate through these, and a lot of it was just implicit biases that people were having about you?
It goes back to those tools and those values and those things that you carry with you wherever you go. And one of those things that I carried with me wherever I went was my willingness to work hard and be competent. So, I always, in my back of my mind, had the knowledge that I knew that I could do the job that they sent me to do better than the last person who had the job. I just always carried that type of confidence. So, I don't know if the conversations in the 80s and 90s were different than we're able to have in our work. We're much more evolved in our workplaces now, from my perspective. And I came through my introductory period in the workplace, just when times were different, when it was normal to say, well, boys will be boys. And we don't do that now. I mean, that phrase in itself is like, that's that's going to get you cut at the water cooler.
Yeah.
And so the times were different, and so you really had to rely on your own confidence. So I wish I could say, I wish I could give that, like, that magic thing that it was, but it goes back, I think, to just understanding your own values, understanding what your own skills are, and not letting somebody, like I said, I didn't let them talk me out of my dignity. And I didn't let them talk me out of the fact that I could be as competent in any of those tasks as any of my peers.
No, that's a really, really good point. So I had like one more thought before we go to all these questions. Something else I was like wondering about, if you could give advice for that, I would say young person who's early in their career, whether in the military or not in the military, who is somebody even who's operating at the margin of some particular identity, whether it's around maybe it's like maybe around race, gender, sexuality, maybe it's around folks who learn a little bit differently than the masses. What would you tell them as they're entering like the early part of their career?
Is that wherever you are at, you belong there. Don't let other people or other messaging and a lot of times we check ourselves out just because of things that we think people are going to say to us, rather than anything we've ever actually heard. So just know that if you are there, you belong in that room. And also, don't be afraid to ask for what you want. So if there is a particular position that you want, if there's a particular special assignment that you are interested in doing, if there's something that, because again, where people are looking at all of us, whether they mean it or not, you said the implicit bias in a particular, they're screening through their stereotypes. And I know I've had this happen before, where I've asked for a particular job and they were like, oh, I never even thought about considering you for that, but now that you bring it up, yeah, I think you can do that. So you belong there, and don't be afraid to ask to do that thing that you think you want to go do.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, don't self-select out. I love that. I love that. And one of the NYU professors, Professor Galloway, that gives talks, he always says, "Command the space that you occupy." That kind of reminded me of that too. If you're just going to do the job, just do it well. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just to say, I just had this amazing experience. I went down to Fort Benning in Georgia last week, and that's where they train our infantry and our armor officers. And within the last 3 years, that's opened up to young women in the Army to be able to hold those branches. And I will tell you that there is so much badassery going on. These women are so confident and they come into the room, and I think of it this way, is that they're not afraid to take up the space that's in the room. They do not get in the back row, they do not try and hide themselves. They come in naturally and take the space that is already theirs. And it's just wonderful to see the generation of strong young people, both men and women, strong young people who are coming into not only our military but into the workforce.
Yeah, great. Yeah, they had some Major General Tammy Smith to look up to. This is great. We're gonna go over to audience questions. Where we have like 15 minutes left. This one's from Plymouth. With the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, how were the previous less than honorable discharges dealt with? Were they able to be revised? Yeah, we talked about this a bit, but Tammy, if you want to expound.
Yeah, there was nothing automatic about it. So it isn't as if the Army or any of the services went through a database and found people and like sent a notice to them and said, you know, now's your chance to apply for an upgrade. So it was more of a discussion, word of mouth through the community, that you had the opportunity. Now, when repeal first happened, even if you were to apply for an upgrade, I mean, it was still a really, really difficult process, to get your paper upgraded, because we were just new into this. This was in 2011. I will tell you now, 10 years afterwards, it's a much more streamlined process, and there's much more education of the individuals who are responsible for the upgrade process to understand about the implicit bias and some things that were part of this. What happened with a lot of these discharges, and the ones that were simply for being gay, those were actually relatively more easy because that was the only reason. And so when that reason didn't make sense, when we look at it through today's lens, that's easy to upgrade. But unfortunately, what happened to many of our service members is that there would be like a pile on of charges. And so you knew they were gay, you wanted to get them out, you couldn't quite prove it. So then they were late for formation, where another soldier might have, had to do push ups for that. This soldier, because they were gay, then also got an Article 15, for failure to uh, to be there on time. And so there was a pile-on of charges. Those became a little bit more complicated because you got kicked out not only for being gay, but for misbehavior. And so also our process had to evolve a little bit to unpeel, to understand that some of those pile-ons were because they were gay. They didn't become misbehaving because they were gay. It was that got piled on as the reason to make sure that they were able to kick them out. But the process has evolved, and many people have come forward and taken advantage of that.
Yeah, Taylor, you're bringing something up that about how the sexuality, like how Don't Ask, Tell was very dangerous since they weaponized people's identities in such a way to where just essentially blackmail.
Yeah.
And then also, it's particularly you just think about the power dynamics for soldiers that were LGBTQ,
Yeah.
and these are folks who are coming from a lot of, from working class places across the country. It's like this is how they get their health care and their way of, and it's to have their identity weaponized that way, which is deeply psychologically damaging, and along with just like economically disempowering in many ways. I think we got a few more sets of questions. Dan Link Show asked, was your chain of command supportive when you came out post Don't Ask, Don't Tell? Can you share about particular leaders or others who support you at that time or throughout your career?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It was, I'm going to tell you, it was mixed at first. Institutionally, the Army was like, we're on board with this, and they helped me along before my promotion, knowing that this was going to be a media thing, and they did several things to help me. Within our own headquarters, I still got resistance. So I got a really mixed message of like, you should do this, don't you dare do this. Yes, you should. No, please don't. And so, I mean, these were going on at the same time. And for me, it was the leadership aspect of it that I thought it was the right thing to do. But mostly my experience was positive. After the initial, like I say, it was a big news thing, and again, and that was the scary part, is just to be public about it. And I kind of took the brunt of that, so people coming behind me, they didn't have to go through that. But mostly the Army was supportive of that. I got positive reinforcement in the form of just the comments that came from other senior leaders and the people that I was peers with, all the way to evolving to when I had an assignment and I went to the Republic of Korea to be the Deputy Commanding General for support in 8th Army. The command there absolutely welcomed Tracy, as who she was, as my wife. Even though we were working then in an environment where the culture of Korea was different than that, and how they approach, there is no same-sex marriage law there or anything that necessarily protects people who identify from the LGBT community. But my chain of command there, my folks were so welcoming of who I was with Tracy. I never ever got any like tone it down or be careful here. I never got that. I got nothing but acceptance during that particular assignment.
Yeah, and Tammy, I wanted to ask you like a question around. So, Vice President Kamala Harris in an interview talked about how, she's obviously support who's breaking glass ceilings, but she says, when you break through glass ceilings, there's also shards of glass to get caught up. If you're comfortable, like, what are some of your shards of glass that you caught as you were breaking this particular glass ceiling?
You know what? I'm going to have to reflect on that, because for the most part, my experience was positive. It was the visibility, and now it's kind of like I'm globally gay now, so I don't know if that's a shard of glass or if that's something to celebrate now. But I'm going to have to say that my experience was positive. But again, I was doing it from a values perspective, from a leader perspective. I had a lot of support. Tracy was very, very supportive of that. And I recognize also the privilege of doing this as a general, as opposed to maybe a lieutenant coming out to their platoon, or a sergeant in the ranks. I recognize the privilege that I have, is that less people are going to be mean to a general or to enact on their homophobia with a general than they are with somebody who is lower in rank. So. Uh, it's also that first thing of, a lot of the things that I said about being authentic in those early interviews. I
Mhm.
will tell you that on the inside I wasn't. That what I learned over time is that authenticity starts with honesty. And honesty is that first step, whether it's being honest with yourself about who you are, or being honest with those people around you who work with you, your family. Honest is just the first step. We like to think, well, now that I've been honest, well, all of a sudden I'm my authentic self. But my own personal journey for me was that there's some work that has to occur between honest and authentic. We'll each do that work in our own ways. And maybe that was a bit of the shards of glass, is because I made mistakes personally along the way in that first step as honest, where I claimed I was authentic. But I'm going to tell you that authenticity, that comfort, that feeling comfortable in my own skin, came a little bit more over time. But again, the Army created an environment for me where
Yeah,
I could grow in that way.
yeah, no, I think what you're talking about is something that so many LGBTQ people, like I've definitely felt it, where there's, once you have dealing with that raucous of a conversation you're having with yourself, and you start to talk to more people, but then you're like in an environment, you're trying to figure out, oh, do I tell this person, like, what is it's just like, what is like the relevance, just like navigating that, just, it's just a continual process,
Yeah.
self-acceptance.
And we know too, members of marginalized communities, is my own experience, is that you internalize much of the messaging from society. In Tracy and I, for Pride Month, we watched recently the Celluloid Closet, just about imaging in films of
Mhm.
gay people over time, and it was a good reminder. So can you take all this stuff in, and you internalize some of this homophobia? And so my starting position was an expectation that people were going to be mean to me, that people were going to say horrible things, that I was going to get hate mail, that, I expected all of those things to happen as a result of my public promotion. And I will tell you that Not one person outside of, comments and Twitter probably and all that, which I paid no attention to. Not one person went out of their way to send me hate mail or to send me something negative that was to me personally, to tell me that I had done something wrong. But I expected it. That that was my expectation, and that was the first step of the honesty. And now that I've moved more towards authentic, I've been able to push some of that internalized stuff away in a way that's much more healthy for me.
Yeah, and also just like that fear is very much warranted, just given like the history of just how LGBTQ people, and then especially those that are intersection, like men, women, and then folks who like people of color in general. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. We have one more question before we wrap up. Uh, from Dan, in what ways is the Army/military more inclusive today than when you joined as a second lieutenant? What are some of the key challenges the military has today in building a more diverse and inclusive force?
Yeah. Yeah, it is the 35 years, like both as a woman, as a member of the LGBT community, it's the change in policy that is where you can really say that they did something that was positive towards making a more inclusive and accepting army. One of the challenges that they will still have is that we're a pyramid and we grow from the bottom to the top. And so even as we bring in more of diversity in a particular framework, it still is going to take us 20 to 25 years to grow them into senior leaders in the organization. So I think that one of the things that the Army can do to ensure that our diversity stays with us is that they have to take some of the hits from what you all do in for-profit spaces. Is that it's about the bottom line, and you want to know who's leaving your organization, and you want to understand who's staying, why they come in, why they're leaving. And I think that that having seen the good work of the policy changes and the intent to follow our values and getting the best talent to stay in, is that we really have to hold ourselves in the military. I could say how I used to be in the military, accountable, by understanding what the data is telling us about who is going to stay with us and who is leaving us. Because I want some of those young women that I met down at the Armor and Infantry School. I wanted to make it all the way through. I want to set conditions where that they can make it to the upper half of that pyramid.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. It's just being, I think, the challenge for a lot of organizations in going into the 21st century, as we're starting to get rid of a lot of these exploitative systems, is how do we like unleash the human creativity and talent as as technology is becoming more and more advanced, and diversity and inclusion is very much that's another reason why it's like super important. Is that the problems are getting more dynamic, so we need people just to have like the time and space to solve a more complicated
Yeah,
world.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
Tammy, this has been such a joy and such a privilege for us here at Google. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Talks at Google series. You are a trailblazer beyond measure. I've thoroughly enjoyed like listening to you, and then also just reading some of like the stories that we didn't that weren't known to at least like to me. And I'm also just want to also we didn't talk about her like as much, but if you want to say anything about your wife too,
Ah,
like a quick shout out to her. Happy wife,
she
happy life.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell you what, Tracy is like, I am mildly interesting when Tracy's in the room. She is just absolutely awesome. And I credit there were some folks who helped me be braver than I would have been if I were on my own going through this particular transition in my life. And she is high on that list, of people who helped me be braver than I would have been on my own. So thank you for allowing me to give her a shout out. I think she's streaming this somewhere on her phone. So thanks for allowing me to say something about her.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you again, and thanks everybody for joining us here today at the Talks at Google series. Happy Pride, everybody.
Happy Pride.